Hello and welcome to Mississippi Insight. I'm Byron Brown. Thank you for joining us. Coming up on this week's program, moves to allow more purges from the state's voting rolls run into fierce opposition in the legislature. But they also have some powerful supporters. Also, are Republican voters sticking with Governor Tate Reeves? UL Politics' Frank Corder walks us through a new poll of those voters. And how would occupational licensing reforms benefit Mississippi? Russ Latino joins us from Empower Mississippi to explain his support for the reforms. First this week, deep divisions over bills that were designed to clean up voter rolls. Opponents say it's another form of voter suppression. The bills would give election commissioners the green light to remove the name of a person who fails to vote at least once during a period of 4 consecutive years. It would also apply if a voter fails to respond to certified mail from the Election Commission. It's a change from the current law, which allows voters to be purged if they die, move away, or are judged mentally incompetent. We'll hear from an opponent of these measures shortly. First, Lieutenant Governor Delbert Hosemann discussed the measures at length this week. He did not author these Republican-led bills, but he's a strong supporter of purging voter rolls. Here are his comments from earlier this week.
You know, well, first of all, the bill that came out of Senator Tate's is a bill to assist the Board of Supervisors and everyone else who relies on voter rolls in Mississippi. It's not necessarily to remove people from the voter rolls. I want to get that straight. What it says is that if you haven't voted in 2 presidential elections, we send you a postcard to make sure you're still here. And if you don't reply to that postcard within, like, I think it's another 4 years, then they will take you off the roll. Now, if all of that occurs just on a normal course of events, it's about 8 or 10 years that you haven't showed up to vote for anything. Not a city council member, a constable, or a governor, or a president. Now, why is that important? Because every year we try to get a jury pool. And to get a jury pool, we have to send out announcements. Like in Hinds County and these other counties, they send out hundreds of announcements to just get 50 people to show up. Why is that? Because a lot of people have left and moved somewhere else. So it's real important that the voter rolls be right. Real important. Now, we have a process. If you die, of course, the circuit clerks and the election commissioners are allowed to do that. The only people that can remove somebody from a voter roll is the election commissioners, not the government. So this is a process which, by the way, is also a federal process. In the federal process, if you were to mail out a jury for a jury summons, for example, and it doesn't come back, you can then mail them the same kind of postcard that we're talking about here and ask, are you still here? Are you still alive? You know, that process is in federal law. This is actually longer, this process that Senator Tate was proposing. And it tracks, he informed me, it tracks the United States Supreme Court decision in the Ohio case, Husted versus someone up there about this. Now, the voter rolls, having them to a process in which they're accurate is really important. I don't think you have to go much further than the last election to see people have questions about that. And in Mississippi, when we served you as Secretary of State, I believe your article, one of your articles said we had 22 or 24 counties that had more people registered to vote than were alive in them and eligible to vote. That's not acceptable. It's costly for the Board of Supervisors. It causes people to question the validity of the ballot box. We can't have that. So one of the solutions to that was to ask our election commissioners to purge the voter rolls. I had strike teams for years that went out. I went with them on some occasions, and we would sit with the election commissioners and explain to them the process by which they could bring their voter rolls up to date. I think at one time I had it down to like 2 counties that had more people registered to vote than were alive and over the age of 18. And I think it may have proliferated some since then. So no, this is not, in my mind, not some action to remove people from voting. It's an action to have Board of Supervisors not spend a whole lot of money And you at least hopefully would be encouraged by the postcard to come cast a ballot. So I don't see it as a removal thing. I see it as something that clears up voter rolls, which we desperately need to do. It is a continuing thing, Emily. I mean, you can get them straight this year and people move around. So you have to work on this every year. So to miss 2 presidential elections, or 2 or 3 governor elections, or city council elections, ignore a postcard for 4 years, then you can still come back and register to vote. So I think to get those voter rolls right, I think it's very important. I think it's important to the state, and quite frankly, I think it's important to the country.
So you have the lieutenant governor's take, now the opposition. Zippy Summers is a Democratic lawmaker representing District 68 in Jackson. She told 12 News' Tal Tal this week about the potential pitfalls with voter roll purges.
I am deeply concerned about the House bill as well as the Senate bill that would purge Mississippi voters. I don't believe that voting should be a use it or lose it right. We have the Second Amendment. I own a gun, just like many other Mississippians own a gun. Just because I don't shoot it doesn't mean that I lose my Second Amendment right. And I'm viewing these pieces of legislation in the same way. I agree that voters who have, passed, those who have moved or been disenfranchised should be removed from the voter rolls. That's just a part of voter roll maintenance. But I don't believe that election commissioners should be charged with purging voters from the rolls simply because they did not vote in 4 years.
Now, is this part of you were previous part of the Hinds County election?
I was, yeah.
Is this partly why you're so strongly, opposed to this bill?
Well, not only because I'm a former election commissioner, but because I believe that voting is the cornerstone of our democracy. And so if we are to have a democracy, the stronger that our democracy can be depends on the folks who get to participate. And so we should not be taking away that access because they may or may not receive a notification card or because they maybe didn't care for who was on the ballot and decided not to vote, or because they're a soldier that's serving overseas and didn't get a chance to vote, or a senior that may be in the hospital. We're dealing with a pandemic, and we saw how the effects of that last year during the November election, where folks turned out in droves to vote by absentee because of the fear or anxiety about going to the polls. So there are all kinds of circumstances that could keep someone from voting, and we shouldn't just take them off the rolls simply because of that particular circumstance.
How would this affect Mississippians specifically, Ms. Summers?
Well, I think when you look at the history of the state of Mississippi and that we were ground zero for the Voting Rights Act, and knowing that everything that we've been through in order to get certain communities the right to vote, that Mississippi shouldn't be in the business of then disenfranchising those voters. These bills are clearly attempts to suppress the vote. And while I am a lawmaker, I don't believe that politicians should be in charge of determining who gets to vote for them. I think that this is, in response, unfortunately, to what happened in November. And, just because the election didn't turn out the way that you would have liked it to be, doesn't mean that you come back the next session and make it harder for folks to vote. If anything, we should be looking at proposals that make it easier for people to vote. So if we're going to purge folks in this way, which I hope these bills don't make it through, then we should also be looking at ways where we can make it easier for people to be able to re-register. That was the biggest issue in Ohio. Not only were their purges filled with errors, but they also made it so that people could re-register fairly easily. In Mississippi, we don't have online voter registration. We don't have same-day voter registration. And so if you're within that window, that 30-day window before an election, and you're purged and you don't have an opportunity to re-register, well, guess what? You don't get to vote in that next election. And so you have to wait for the next election before you can raise your voice and participate in the process. And that's just simply not the way it should be in the state of Mississippi.
Those who are for the bill, Lieutenant Governor Hoseman, What are your thoughts to that? He says it's not necessarily removing people from the voter rolls, but what do you have to say to that?
Well, that's exactly what it is. The process now, at least when I was an election commissioner, is if you received a notification card and you didn't return that, or it returned back to the office, you were marked inactive. That did not begin the process of actually taking you off the rolls, but you were marked inactive. And I'm actually kind of surprised to hear Lieutenant Governor Hosemann say that he supports this bill. He's the former Secretary of State. At one point in time, he put together a committee that looked at election and voting reform to help make our system better, to help modernize our system and make it easier for election officials and voters. And so my hope would have been when he came into office that he would continue pushing and advocating for those efforts. And I think that his sentiments around purging voters is misplaced.
That's Democratic lawmaker Zippy Summers of Jackson, preceded by Lieutenant Governor Delbert Hosemann on the contentious topic of voter rolls. After the break, Frank Quarter on whether Governor Reeves' base is sticking with him. It's Mississippi Insight on 12 News. Last month, a statewide poll found Governor Tate Reeves' approval rating hovering right around 34%, but a new survey of Republican voters paints a different picture. 1 year in, the governor enjoys strong support within his party. Y'all Politics conducted the survey, and joining us via Zoom is managing editor Frank Quarter. And Frank, this is a survey of around 600 Republican primary voters. Nearly 3/4 identify as Republican, and about a third say that they are strongly conservative. Is this essentially the governor's base?
It is, and I think it's important, Byron, to note that any accurate polling that's been done in this state has to center largely on those Republican voters, because given the trends of elections in this state, those are the people who do go vote, and they are putting the governor and others in office. So yes, this is the governor's base.
Older people love him, young people not so much. Why do you think that is?
Well, traditionally, the GOP voters have traditionally been over 40, and they are more prone to support candidates with very aggressive policy positions when it comes to the GOP's platform. Younger voters sometimes are not as apt to lean towards the GOP, but if you look at the poll, he's nearing 50% even with that demographic.
40% are somewhat favorable. Should that be concerning to the governor?
No, I don't think so. I think if you look at his overall favorability, coupled with his job approval rating and his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is upwards of 70%, that should be very encouraging for the governor and his staff.
Lieutenant Governor Delbert Hosemann also with strong favorables. What do you equate that to?
Yeah, Delbert Hosemann's always been a favorite of the people of Mississippi since his time as the Secretary of State. He kind of endeared himself with the voters back in his first election when he ran for Secretary of State with the little old lady on the bench that could not get his name right. And since then, he has kind of, like I said, endeared himself with voters. And so far during his term as the Lieutenant Governor, he continues to enjoy high favorability among the GOP voters.
Governor Reeves is calling for the repeal of that state income tax, and there's strong support in the party for that. What do you make for that?
There is, and I think that's just a realization that GOP voters, they want to keep more of their hard-earned money in their pockets, and they are backing this phase out of this state income tax at a very high rate. Upwards of about 60% or more, which shows that people are just fed up with being overtaxed and overburdened. They want to keep more of their hard-earned dollars that they're working for day in and day out.
Also, teacher pay getting high support with that 10% version.
Yeah, the teacher pay raise has sometimes been seen as more of a Democrat type issue, but the GOP voter base, they are saying at a high margin, 71%, that if teacher pay can pass with a 10% increase, they are all for it. Because they understand, I believe, that investing in education is only beneficial to this state. Now, whenever you take that poll and you move it up to 20%, at this time, it is not as favorable, and the percentage of support goes way down.
Let's just shift gears just a little bit. Talk about the state of the Republican Party following the election. Congresswoman Lynn Cheney faced a vote on her leadership position after she voted to impeach President Trump. She held onto that spot overwhelmingly, and there's also some division about controversial freshman Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene and her past support of the QAnon. What do you make of what's going on there?
Well, fortunately, Mississippi has been kind of removed from that drama up in Congress. Our state party has been more focused on getting the city elections underway and trying to find ways to increase its base in local governments. And during this cycle, as far as the national platforms go, the platform and policies remain the same. The GOP has to not be focused on personalities and chasing conspiratorial theories. They've got to be focused on policy that actually makes a difference. And I think as we move beyond some of these antics happening within Congress, from the impeachment trial to some of these, wanting to unseat duly elected officials from different states, those things will die down as everyone's tempers soften over the next few weeks, and hopefully policy will rule the day, not personality.
Frank Corder, always good talking to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Byron. Appreciate it.
All right, and we'll be right back. A bill aimed at making it easier for some professionals to move to Mississippi remains alive after this week's legislative deadline. Senate Bill 2817 would require licensing boards to issue occupational licenses without new testing or classroom training if an individual held a license in good standing from another state for at least 1 year. So why is that important? And that benefit should Mississippians expect if this measure becomes law? Russ Latino joins us to explain. He's the president of the nonprofit group Empower Mississippi. Russ, we welcome to Mississippi Insight.
Thank you for having me, Byron.
Well, tell us about the SB 2817 and what it seeks to address.
Yeah, so in the 1950s, there were very, very few professions that required what's called an occupational license. And it's really just a regulation that allows someone to practice a certain profession. It used to be associated with things like airline pilots or doctors or lawyers, the kinds of professions that you would think of where someone could potentially do something wrong and really injure the public. And since the 50s, we've seen this massive expansion of the number of professions that are licensed, such that about 25% of all workers today require some government permission to do their job. Very often these licenses are sort of driven by a board that promulgates rules and regulations and fees and training and all sorts of requirements. And one of the reforms that's been looked at is not only how do we make it easier for people in the state of Mississippi to get a good job, to ultimately be able to provide for their family, be a good part of their community, but really, how do we also make it easier for people who want to move into Mississippi? You think about, as an example, there are educators in the state of Mississippi who are doing a tremendous job, but we know that there's an education shortage. There's a shortage of teachers in Mississippi. So that if you've got people who are licensed to teach in other states, we want them to come to Mississippi, ultimately to be able to serve our students. And there are countless examples like that of professions where we lack the requisite numbers to really serve our population. What the bill does is to say, you know what, if you've been licensed in another state, if another state has put you through the ringer of making sure that you're qualified to do a job, or you've proven because you've got years of experience that you're able to do that job, then we're going to recognize that license, we're going to recognize that experience, And so instead of making you jump through a bunch of hoops, we're going to allow you to immediately start your profession if you choose to move to Mississippi and immediately start benefiting people with the services that you're providing to them. So it's happened in a handful of states, but candidly, in a lot of ways, Mississippi is on the cutting edge of some real reforms, not just with the bill that we're talking about today. The House of Representatives passed 4 or 5 huge bills yesterday, do very similar things. So we're very excited as an organization. This is an issue that we've worked on for a long time, are passionate about, because we really want to create an atmosphere where Mississippians have more opportunity economically to ultimately take care of their families and contribute to their communities.
So Russ, again, on this issue of the licensure, would someone who comes from another state with a license, would they eventually have to get a license in Mississippi, or would they just be able to continue to work their career with the out-of-state license?
So there are actually 2 bills that deal with this. The Senate bill that you mentioned that was filed by Senator Kevin Blackwell, which is a great bill. There's also a bill that passed out of the House yesterday, House Bill 1263, that was filed by Representative Becky Curry. They approach things a little bit differently, but the essence of both approaches is that if you get here and you were previously licensed in another state, then the licensing board of whatever your profession is, provided that we have such a board in Mississippi, will essentially issue you a license in Mississippi without you having to go, for instance, some of these professions would require, thousands of hours of training to get a new license. You don't have to go through that whole process. So you would still get issued a new license, but it essentially short circuits or shortcuts all of the sort of burdensome things that are associated with qualifying for the license, if that makes any sense.
Russ Latino with Empower Mississippi. Thank you for joining us here on Mississippi Insight.
Thank you for having me, Byron.
All right, and we'll be right back. We want to thank our guest this week, Y'all Politics, Frank Corder, and Empower Mississippi's Russ Latino. We'll be back next weekend in our usual time slot, Sunday morning at 10:30, with more of the political and current affairs coverage that you demand. I'm Byron Brown. From all of us here at 12 News, make it a good weekend.